In the frost-bitten town of Timber Creek, where whispers lingered longer in cold air than gunsmoke, they say the man with the steadiest hands was the one you should fear the most. That's what the notorious Blackwell brothers would discover on a bitter January night in 1878, when they made the fatal error of drawing steel on the silent stranger who poured their whiskey. They couldn't have known that the weathered figure methodically cleaning glasses behind the warped oak bar of the Wayward Raven had more notches on his revolvers than their entire gang combined, or that their drunken threats would resurrect a ghost the territory thought long buried, the merciless nightshade. The deep winter chill had settled into the bones of Timber Creek like an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed its welcome. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Snow piled in dirty drifts against the buildings, and ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the windows of the Wayward Raven saloon. Inside, the pot-bellied stove fought a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every crack in the weathered walls. Thomas "Shade" Morgan worked with practiced efficiency, his movements deliberate and economical as he arranged bottles along the back wall. In 3 years of tending bar, Margaret Winters had never once seen him make a wasted motion or speak an unnecessary word. Every glass was polished to perfection, every bottle precisely aligned, his lean frame moving with the quiet grace of a mountain cat. "Shade," Margaret called softly from her position by the ledger, tallying the week's modest earnings. "Have you ever considered taking a day for yourself? Perhaps go fishing at Miller's Creek when the ice breaks?" The question earned her the barest upturn of his lips, a ghost of an expression that passed for a smile these days. "And what would I do with myself, Miss Margaret?" His voice was low and smooth as aged bourbon, the kind of voice that made folks lean in closer to hear. It was also the kind of voice people routinely underestimated, which suited Shade just fine. The saloon was quiet this evening, just a handful of regulars seeking refuge from the biting wind. Old Jenkins nursed his usual rye in the corner, while Doc Hayes studied his medical journal at his regular table near the stove. The doctor glanced up occasionally, his knowing eyes meeting Shade's in silent communication. Of all the people in Timber Creek, only Hayes knew why the hands that now so carefully measured whiskey had once been feared throughout 3 territories. The peaceful routine was shattered by the jingling of spurs as Sheriff Caldwell burst through. The bat-wing doors, trailing cold air and worry in equal measure. His weathered face was creased with concern beneath his frost-rime moustache. "Evening, Margaret Shade," he nodded to them both, then made his way to the bar. "Got word from Silver Pass. The Blackwell brothers been spotted heading this way." Shade's hands didn't pause in their work, but something flickered in his storm-grey eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Margaret didn't miss much, though. She'd been running the Wayward Raven long enough to read men better than most. "Isaiah Blackwell?" she asked, her voice dropping low, though the saloon was nearly empty. "I thought he and his brothers kept to the Northern Territories. Times change," Caldwell sighed, accepting the coffee Shade silently placed before him. "They've hit 3 towns in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier pickings now that the territorial marshals have increased patrols up north." Doc Hayes had set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many ride with them now, William?" 8 that we know of," the sheriff replied, warming his hands around the steaming mug. "Isaiah, his brothers Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that Mexican. Gunman they call El Gato, the Wallace twins, and those 2 new ones, mean pair of brothers from Missouri called the Sullivans. They don't just rob, they make examples, like to humiliate a town before they bleed it dry." Shade's hands finally stilled on the glass he was polishing. For just a moment, his fingers traced a thin scar that ran across his left palm, a habit none of them had ever mentioned, but all had noticed. "Timber Creek's got nothing worth there. And trouble," Margaret said firmly, as if speaking it would make it true. "They'll pass us by." "Maybe," Caldwell agreed, but his eyes drifted to Shade. Still, it might be wise to send word to Fort Harrison, get some cavalry out here just in case. Takes 3 days for cavalry to arrive from the fort. Shade spoke softly, resuming his methodical polishing. If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You seem mighty sure about that. Just arithmetic, Sheriff, nothing more, but his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Old Jenkins chose that moment to shuffle to his feet, fishing in his threadbare pockets for coins. Reckon I better head home before that storm front moves in. Sky's got that look again. Just like always, Jenkins. Margaret smiled, making a note in her ledger as the old man shuffled out. Doc Hayes gathered his things as well. Think I'll do the same. Shade, don't forget to pick up that medicine I ordered for your headaches. Came in on yesterday's supply wagon. Shade nodded, though everyone in the room knew he hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he always kept his right hand free when serving drinks, or how his eyes constantly scanned the room, even when it was empty. As the evening deepened, Claire Summers arrived for her nightly piano performance, her honey-colored hair catching the lamplight as she arranged her sheet music. Her playing, when she began to warm up, was light and melodious, a rare beauty in a town that had precious little of it. "Rider coming," Margaret announced from her position by the window. "Moving fast." Shade's hands remained steady as he arranged glasses on a tray, but his stance shifted subtly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple bartender preparing for the evening rush. But Sheriff Caldwell saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside the saloon. The bat-wing doors burst open, revealing Tommy. Wilson, the young stable boy from the livery, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sheriff Caldwell," he gasped out. "They're coming, the Blackwell brothers. They just shot up Clearwater Junction. Killed the marshal and half the town. They're headed this way." In the sudden silence that followed, Shade carefully set down the glass he was holding. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a cougar uncoiling before a leap. "How far?" Caldwell demanded. 3 hours, maybe less. They're moving fast, and the stable boy swallowed hard. They're leaving nothing but death behind them. Margaret's hand went to her throat. "Merciful heavens." "Get word to everyone," Caldwell ordered. "Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark." He turned to Margaret. "Might want to close up early tonight." "No." Shade's quiet voice cut through the tension like a well-honed blade. "Keep the saloon open, just like any other night." They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the bottle-lined shelves before him, but something from long ago. "Shade?" Margaret's voice held a question. "Some folks need to learn," he said softly, "that the most dangerous predator is the one that makes no sound before it strikes." Dusk descended on Timber Creek like a shroud, bringing with it an unnatural stillness that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. The wayward raven maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air thick as gun smoke. Claire's usual cheerful melodies seemed more somber than ever, her fingers dancing across the keys with a nervous energy that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Sheriff Caldwell had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few patrons who remained hunched over their drinks, speaking in whispers as if afraid their voices might carry beyond the saloon walls. Even old Jenkins, who had returned despite the weather, had sobered enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his rheumy eyes darting between the door and Shade's steady presence behind the bar. "Riders coming in from the east," Caldwell announced, his hand instinctively moving to his holstered Colt. The saloon fell silent, save for the soft clink of glasses as Shade continued his work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling. Drummers seeking shelter for the night, but their news brought no comfort. "Passed through Clearwater Junction this morning," the older of the two men said, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his whiskey. "Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the bank, they made examples of anyone who crossed them. Marshall Bennett," he trailed off, taking another drink. "What about Marshall Bennett?" Margaret pressed, though her face suggested she didn't really want to know. "They made him kneel in the street," the drummer managed. "Shot his deputies one by one. While he watched, then He couldn't finish. Doc Hayes, who had returned to the saloon despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. "How many dead?" "7 that I counted," the man whispered. "Would have been more, but it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Blackwell brothers." Shade's movements had slowed, almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of inventory, but Margaret noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot beneath the bar, where she knew a sawed-off shotgun had hung unused for the past 3 years. The younger drummer, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. "Lucky for us, we've got a sheriff here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Isaiah Blackwell. They say he's got 27 notches on his gun." A strange sound came from behind the bar, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to Shade, who had paused in his work. "Something funny about that, bartender?" the young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 27 notches, Shade said quietly, resuming his task. "Man who needs to count that high isn't much of a gunfighter." The drummer's face reddened. "What would you know about it? You're just a—" "That's enough," Margaret cut in sharply. "Shade, could you check the cellar? I think we're running low on that Kentucky bourbon." Shade nodded and moved toward the cellar door. As he passed Doc Hayes's table, the physician spoke in a voice only Shade could hear. "Your old injury is bothering. Ague." "Not yet," Shade replied softly, "but it will be." Claire struck up another tune, this one about a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Sheriff Caldwell moved to the bar. "Margaret, a word?" He glanced around before continuing in a low voice. "You should know I sent a rider to Fort Harrison, but even if they send help immediately, they won't get here in time." "I know," Margaret finished quietly. She looked toward the cellar door. "William, about Shade." "Some secrets," the sheriff warned, "are best left buried." But secrets, like the ghosts of the hanged, had a way of refusing to stay put. This became apparent when 3 local ranchers burst into the saloon, their faces pale with fear. "Found Jacob Miller's body out by Widow's Creek," one of them reported breathlessly. "Shot clean through both knees before they put a bullet in his head. His horse was still saddled. Couldn't have been dead more than an hour." The news hit the room like a physical blow. Jacob Miller was just a kid, barely 20, who ran messages between towns for extra money to support his aging mother. "They're closer than we thought," Caldwell grimaced. "Margaret, maybe now's the time to—" The sound of shattering glass cut through the air as the young drummer dropped his bottle, but it wasn't the noise that silenced the room. It was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, followed by a woman's scream. Shade emerged from the cellar, his face impossible to read. But there was something different about him now, something in the way he moved, as if the quiet bartender was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. The sound of distant gunfire echoed again, closer this time. "Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before, "you might want to get these folks home while they still can." Caldwell studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, everyone out. Head straight home. Bar your doors," He turned to Margaret. "You too. This is my saloon." She started to protest, but Shade interrupted. "Please, Miss Margaret, for once, don't argue." Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Doc Hayes lingered. "Need any help?" "Best get your medical bag ready, Doc," Shade replied, beginning to move bottles from the top shelf to below the bar. "Something tells me you'll need it before morning." The sound of gunfire came again, closer this time, accompanied by wild, drunken whoops that carried on the frigid night air. The Blackwell brothers were coming, and with them the end of peace in Timber Creek. As Margaret finally allowed herself to be led out by Sheriff Caldwell, she looked back at Shade. He stood behind his bar, as he had countless times before, but now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years, the way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who'd seen violence. This was a man who had once been violence itself. The Blackwell brothers didn't so much enter Timber Creek as they infected it. Their arrival brought a silence that swept through the streets like a winter wind, extinguishing lamps and driving the townsfolk behind locked doors. Only the wayward raven's lights remained bright, a defiant beacon in the spreading darkness. Shade heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rhythm of 8 horses moving at a deliberate pace, not the hurried gallop of outlaws fleeing justice, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He kept polishing the same glass, his movements unchanged as the sound of boots and spurs grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The batwing doors exploded inward with unnecessary force, knocked partially off their hinges by a rifle butt. Isaiah Blackwell entered first, a tall man with eyes like frozen steel and a snow-dusted black coat that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the room. His clothes were expensive, but splattered with dark stains that spoke of recent violence. Behind him came his brothers, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, moving with the synchronicity that comes from years riding together. El Gato followed, a lithe Mexican whose weathered face betrayed no emotion. The Wallace twins flanked him, their identical appearances made more unsettling by the matching scars that ran from their left eyes to their jawlines. The Sullivan brothers, Liam and Patrick, brought up the rear, practically vibrating with poorly contained excitement, barely out of the teens, but with eyes already deadened by violence. "What a hospitable establishment." Isaiah's voice carried the refined edge of Eastern education gone sour. "Seems most businesses in this charming town decided to shutter their windows at our approach. How thoughtful of you to keep your doors open for weary travelers." Shade set down his glass with careful precision. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Gentlemen," Ezekiel laughed, the sound like breaking ice on a winter pond. "Hear that, Isaiah? He called us gentlemen." "Your finest whiskey," Blackwell ordered, dropping into a chair and propping his boots on the nearest table. "Leave the bottle." Shade reached for the top shelf, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 8 sets of them watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. "You're not from around these parts," Shade observed quietly, placing the bottle and glasses on their table. "What gave it away?" Jeremiah Blackwell grinned, his gold tooth catching the lamplight. "The way you wear your guns," Shade replied, turning back toward the bar. "High on the hip, cavalry style. Nobody out here draws from that position." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Isaiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to know a lot about firearms for a bartender." "Man learns things," Shade shrugged, resuming his endless glass polishing. Patrick Sullivan, clearly the younger and more eager to prove himself, drew his pistol with a flourish. "Man learns things, huh? Learn anything about this?" He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. Learn that's a good way to shoot yourself, Shade replied without looking up. The gang laughed, all except Isaiah, who studied Shade with growing interest. You got a name, barkeep? Just Shade. Isaiah nodded slowly, then without warning swept his arm across the table, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Well, just Shade. Blackwell rose, his voice turning ugly. You know what I think? I think you're lying to me, and I don't like being lied to. Shade finally looked up, his face impassive. Bottle was $18. The Sullivan brothers burst out laughing, but Isaiah silenced them with a look. He approached the bar slowly, like a mountain. Lion closing in on prey. $18? That's steep for rot-gut whiskey. He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, flicking it onto the bar. Here's $3. Buy yourself some manners. Shade looked at the coin, then back at Blackwell. Still owe $15. El Gato, Blackwell said softly. Show our friend here what we do to mouthy bartenders. The Mexican gunman grinned and started forward, but at that moment the doors swung open again. Sheriff Caldwell stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. Evening, gentlemen, he said, calm as a Sunday sermon. Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking. A lawman in this little backwater must be our lucky day. Isaiah's smile didn't reach his eyes. Way I hear it, Caldwell continued, stepping inside. Clearwater Junction is missing a marshal and some deputies. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Can't say that we do, Isaiah replied, though his smile grew darker. Though I did hear something interesting about Clearwater. Heard their marshal was a coward, begged for his life while his deputies died. His hand drifted toward his gun. You're not a coward, are you, Sheriff? Everything happened at once. Caldwell's hand dropped to his holster, but Isaiah was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Caldwell stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. William! Shade's voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. Stay behind the bar, Caldwell gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Isaiah holstered his smoking gun. Now where were we? Ah yes, teaching some manners to our friend the bartender. Elgato moved forward again, cracking his knuckles. But this time something had changed in Shade's demeanor. His hands had stopped their endless, wiping motion. His shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a quality that made even the hardened gunman hesitate. Been a long time since I killed a man, Shade said softly, almost to himself. Promised myself. I was done with it. Kill him, Isaiah ordered, annoyed by the delay. Kill him slowly. Elgato reached across the bar to grab Shade's shirt, and that's when everything changed. Shade's hand moved faster than seemed humanly possible, catching the gunman's wrist and yanking him forward. There was a sharp crack as Elgato's face met the solid oak bar. He dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. Well, well, Isaiah drawled, though his hand had dropped back to his gun. Looks like our quiet bartender has some fight in him after all. The brothers spread, outflanking the bar. The Wallaces moved in perfect unison, their identical faces betraying nothing as they circled toward opposite ends of the room. The Sullivan boys bounced on their toes, eager for action, but Shade stood perfectly still now, his eyes fixed on Caldwell's motionless form. Last chance, he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. Take your friends and ride out. Don't make me break my promise. Isaiah's laugh was genuine this time. Or what? You'll serve us to death? He drew his gun with lightning speed. I think it's time we... The sound of a shotgun being racked cut through his words. Shade had produced the weapon from under the bar, its double barrels now pointed squarely at Isaiah's chest. That's what you had in mind all along, wasn't it? Isaiah's smile turned cold. Hiding a scattergun under the bar. Problem is, old man, you can only kill one of us before the others cut you down. True, Shade agreed. Then, with deliberate care, He set the shotgun on the bar. "That's why I won't be using it." His right hand dropped to his side, where no gun had been visible moments before, but now somehow a pair of well-worn Remingtons gleamed in his grip as if they had materialized from thin air. "It's been a while," Shade said softly, "since anyone called me Nightshade." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of the Blackwell gang. Even El Gato, still groggy from his encounter with the bar, stopped trying to stem his bleeding nose. "Nightshade?" Patrick Sullivan whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's just a story. They say he died at Devil's Gorge." "Stories," Shade said quietly, his guns unwavering, "have a way of coming back to life." Isaiah's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. "I heard of you. They say you killed 40 men in a single year. Say you could shoot a man through the heart at 100 yards in a blizzard." "If I'd killed that many," Shade replied, "I wouldn't have bothered counting." The Wallace twins exchanged glances, their synchronous movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far, trying to flank the bar, and now found themselves exposed. "Boy," Shade addressed Patrick Sullivan without taking his eyes off Isaiah, "I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your gun, and don't stop riding till you hit the Dakotas." Sullivan looked uncertain, glancing at Isaiah, who spoke through clenched teeth. "You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself." Behind the bar, Shade shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 7 conscious men to flinch. "Last chance, kid, be smart." For a moment, the young outlaw seemed to waver. Then his face hardened. "No one calls me kid." His hand dropped to his holster. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Sullivan drew his gun, clearing leather with impressive speed, but Shade was faster, impossibly faster. His first shot took Sullivan's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the young man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. Jeremiah and Ezekiel drew in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. Shade's guns seemed to speak twice more, without him even looking in their direction. Both brothers stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. "You've lost your edge, Nightshade," Isaiah sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Time was, you'd have killed them all." "Still might," Shade replied calmly. "Depends on what happens next." Liam Sullivan had managed to regain his feet, drawing a knife from his boot. "I'm gonna gut you, Bartender." "I wouldn't," Shade warned. "You're slower than the others, and I've got 1 bullet left." "1 bullet," Isaiah laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. "Against the 3 of us, those aren't good odds, old man." "Better than you think." Shade's eyes flickered to Caldwell's still form. "William was more than just a sheriff to me. He was there that day at Devil's Gorge, when I hung up my guns. Made me promise to stop killing. Made me swear I'd find another way." His voice grew softer. "But he's dying now, and that promise is fading with him." A movement caught Shade's eye. Margaret Winters stood in the doorway, a rifle in her hands. She had returned despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows. "Devil's Gorge," Isaiah said slowly, recognition dawning. "That's where you gunned down Richard Blackwell and his whole gang. 5 men, they say." 6, Shade corrected. "People always forget about the lookout." Isaiah's face contorted with rage. "Richard Blackwell was my father." The room went deathly still. Even the wounded men stopped their groaning. "Your father," Shade's voice held no emotion, "drew on a 12-year-old boy for stealing a loaf of bread." "You're lying," Isaiah spat, but his gun hand trembled slightly. "The boy had red hair," Shade continued, his eyes never leaving Isaiah's. Your father laughed when the boy begged for mercy, said the territory had no room for thieves. Something flickered in Isaiah's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first glimmerings of an unwelcome truth. You killed him for a bread thief? I killed him. Shade's voice was barely above a whisper, because your father wouldn't stop with just one innocent. Some men get a taste for cruelty, like others get a taste for whiskey. That day, I decided to put him down before he could destroy anyone else. And now I'll put you down. Isaiah's finger tensed on the trigger. Shade nodded toward the Wallace twins, who were inching toward the door. Your men are leaving you. No one leaves, Isaiah barked, but the twins didn't stop their retreat. A cold smile spread across Shade's face. Funny thing about hired guns, they're loyal right up until they realize they're facing Nightshade. The twins bolted for the door, followed closely by a limping Elgato. Only Isaiah and Liam Sullivan remained, along with the wounded men groaning on the floor. Cowards, Isaiah shouted after them, but his voice shook with uncertainty. They're not cowards, Shade said quietly. They've just heard the stories. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows like tiny fists demanding entry. Inside, Isaiah's face twisted with fury and fear, caught between his desire for revenge and his instinct for survival. You know what they say about Nightshade? He asked, struggling to regain control of the situation. They say he disappeared because a woman broke his heart. That true? Something flickered in Shade's eyes. A shadow of old pain. Isaiah had hit a nerve, did I? Isaiah's smile widened. They say she died, say you weren't fast enough to save her. Marcus, Liam warned, seeing something change in Shade's expression. Victoria, Shade said softly, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Her name was Victoria. Margaret, still watching from the shadows near the door, saw Shade's hands tremble slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown all night. Ah, so it is true, Isaiah pressed his advantage. The great Nightshade, brought low by a woman's death. Tell me, did she die quick, or... The shotgun roared its double blast, deafening in the confined space. Isaiah and Sullivan dove in opposite directions as splinters exploded from the wall behind where they had been standing. Shade's boot had pressed a hidden pedal, firing the weapon he'd left on the bar, but he hadn't aimed to kill, only to scatter them. That was your surprise. Under the bar. Isaiah laughed, rolling to his feet. Now what? Now, Shade said quietly, we do this the old way. His guns seemed to materialize in his hands again, but this time Isaiah was ready. Both men fired simultaneously. Shade's bullet took Isaiah's hat off, while Isaiah's shot creased Shade's, shoulder tearing his shirt and drawing blood. First blood to me, Isaiah grinned, but his smile faded as he saw Shade hadn't even flinched. You know why they called me Nightshade? Shade asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Wasn't for the obvious reasons. Wasn't because I was quiet or fast or deadly, though I was all those things. He stepped out from behind the bar for the first time, his movements liquid smooth despite his wound. It was because of what William Caldwell taught me back when he was just a young cavalry officer, and I was just another angry kid with a fast gun. Shut up and fight, Isaiah snarled, but his voice shook slightly. William taught me that a man's shadow is always with him, but you only see it when there's light. Shade took another step forward. He taught me that every killer, every murderer, every man who thinks his gun makes him important, they all cast shadows too. And if you watch those shadows long enough, his gun barked once more, and Sullivan screamed, his hidden derringer, half drawn from his sleeve, clattered across the floor. Impossible, Sullivan gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. You couldn't have seen 3 years, Shade continued, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. 3 years I've watched men draw their guns in this saloon, watched their shoulders tense, their weight shift, their shadows move across the floor, 1,000 little tells that say when a man's about to kill. Fascinating lesson, Isaiah. sneered, though his face had gone pale. "Why did you become a bartender?" For the first time, real emotion crept into Shade's voice. "I became a bartender because William showed me there was more to life than killing. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by his speed with a gun or the notches on his belt. He taught me about peace." "Peace?" Isaiah laughed harshly. "Peace is for cowards. Peace," Shade cut him off, "is for men who've seen enough death to know its true cost. William taught me that. Victoria taught me that. And for 3 years I lived it, until now." "Until now," Isaiah said softly. "Until now," Shade agreed. Doc Hayes's voice cut through the tension. "I've got the bleeding stopped, but he needs proper care, and soon. You hear that?" Shade's voice hardened. "The man you shot, the man who taught me everything I know about being human instead of just being a killer, he's still alive, which means my promise to him still holds." Something like hope flickered across Isaiah's face. "So you won't—" "But here's what William never understood," Shade continued as if Isaiah hadn't spoken. "Sometimes a man has to break a promise to keep a bigger one. Sometimes peace can only be protected by men willing to do violence." Thunder crashed outside, closer now, as the winter storm intensified. In that moment, Margaret saw the transformation. Complete. Saw the quiet bartender she'd known for 3 years become something else entirely. Nightshade no longer seemed like just a legend. "I know what you're thinking," Shade said softly. "You're thinking that even if I am who I say I am, it's been 3 years. You're thinking maybe I've lost my edge, gotten soft pouring drinks to cowboys and miners." His guns disappeared into their holsters. Holsters that somehow seemed more visible now, as if they had always been there, waiting. "You're thinking," he continued, "that you're still faster than some washed-up legend, that the stories about me were just that, stories." "Weren't they?" Liam Sullivan called from his position near the door, trying to sound brave despite his trembling voice. "No," Shade said simply. "They weren't stories. They were warnings." A gust of wind rattled the windows, driving snow through the cracks in the glass and creating ghostly patterns in the lamplight. In that surreal moment, Margaret saw them all frozen like figures in a daguerreotype. Isaiah coiled to strike, Sullivan bleeding by the door, Shade standing amid it all like a man who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. But this respite was shattered by the last thing any of them expected, a child's scream piercing the night air. The child's scream changed everything. In an instant, Shade's eyes snapped toward the broken window, his focus momentarily diverted from Isaiah. "That's Abigail Peters," Margaret gasped, recognizing the voice. "She lives just down the street." A second scream followed, joined by the crack of gunfire and the sound of breaking glass. Isaiah seized his moment, diving behind an overturned table, and coming up with his gun aimed squarely at Shade. "Looks like your town has more company," Isaiah taunted, his confidence returning. "Should have killed me when you had the chance, Nightshade." But Shade wasn't looking at him anymore. His attention had fixed on something beyond the saloon walls, something that had shifted his priorities entirely. "What's out there?" Margaret demanded. "Who else came with you?" Isaiah's laugh held genuine amusement. "Not my men, woman. We rode in from the west. Sounds like someone's coming from the east." His eyes gleamed with malevolent delight. "This territory's crawling with all sorts these days. Could be anyone. The Mason gang, Talon's marauders, or maybe—" His voice dropped to a theatrical whisper, "the McClellan brothers." Something changed in Shade's posture, a stiffening so subtle only someone who knew him well would notice. Margaret saw it immediately. "Shade?" she questioned. But he was already moving toward the door, his earlier standoff with Isaiah seemingly forgotten. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command, "and keep your rifle on our guests." Isaiah raised his gun higher. "You're not going anywhere, Nightshade. We ain't finished." "We are for now," Shade replied, without turning, reaching for his coat hanging behind the bar. "There's a little girl out there." "So you'll just walk out on our little reunion?" Isaiah scoffed. "After I shot your precious sheriff?" Shade finally turned back to face him, and the look in his eyes made even Isaiah flinch. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. If the McClellan brothers are out there, you should be thanking me for leaving, not trying to stop me." "What the hell do you mean by that?" Shade shrugged into his coat, the movement revealing the twin Remingtons now prominently holstered at his sides. "Because if it is them, and I don't stop them now, there won't be a town left by morning, which means no witnesses to whatever I decide to do with you when I get back." Before Isaiah could respond, another scream tore through the night, followed by cruel laughter that carried on the winter wind. "That's them," Isaiah whispered, genuine fear creeping into his voice. Shade moved to Caldwell's side, kneeling briefly. "Hold on, William," he said quietly. "I've got business to attend to, then I'll come back for you." The wounded sheriff's hand grasped weakly at Shade's arm. "Don't become what you were." Shade covered Caldwell's hand with his own. "Some promises have to bend so others don't break." Rising to his feet, he addressed Margaret without looking at her. "Doc Hayes is in the storage room at the back. Get him out here to look after William. And, Margaret—" "Yes? If I'm not back in 20 minutes, or if these gentlemen give you any trouble, shoot them. Don't hesitate." With that he was gone, slipping through the bat-wing doors like a shadow merging with the night. The howling wind kicked up swirls of snow, momentarily obscuring him from view before the darkness swallowed him completely. For a long moment, no one in the saloon moved or spoke. Then Isaiah let out a low whistle. "The McClellan brothers and Nightshade, all in one night. Guess this miserable little town is more interesting than I thought." Margaret kept her rifle trained steadily on him. "Who are these McClellan brothers?" Isaiah's eyes held a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. "Only the most bloodthirsty killers this territory has ever seen. Makes my outfit look like Sunday school teachers." "Worse than you?" Margaret couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "Lady, I rob and kill for money and power." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "The McClellans, they do it because they enjoy it. There's a difference." Outside, the night had gone strangely quiet. The screams had stopped, and even the gunfire had ceased. Only the wind remained, moaning through the eaves like a restless spirit. "How many?" Margaret asked, moving to the window while keeping her rifle pointed at Isaiah. "3 brothers, Josiah, Abraham, and the youngest, Gabriel." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, wincing as he accidentally put weight on his injured leg. "It's the youngest one you got to worry about most. They say he was kicked in the head by a horse as a child, never been right since." In the distance, a single gunshot echoed, followed by absolute silence. "Thought you said they were worse than you," Liam Sullivan muttered from his position on the floor. "Sounds like your legendary Nightshade is making quick work of them." Isaiah's laugh was hollow. "One shot means nothing. The McClellans don't die easy. I've seen them take a dozen bullets and still keep fighting." Margaret strained to see through the frost-covered window, but the street beyond was a canvas of swirling white, revealing nothing of what transpired in the darkness. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited. The only sounds, the labored breathing of the wounded men and the persistent howl of the wind. 10 minutes, Isaiah said quietly, checking his pocket watch. "If he's not back in another 10, you'd better start saying your prayers." "Why do you care?" Margaret challenged. Isaiah's smile held no humor. "Because right now Nightshade is the only thing standing between us and those animals. He knows it too, which is why he left us alive." Another gunshot split the night. This. One closer, then another and another in rapid succession. The distinctive sound of Shade's Remingtons was unmistakable, punctuating the darkness like angry exclamation points. Doc Hayes emerged from the back room, his medical bag in hand, moving immediately to Caldwell's side. "I heard the shooting," he said, kneeling beside the sheriff. "What's happening?" "Shade went out to face the McClellan brothers," Margaret explained, never taking her eyes off Isaiah. The doctor's hands faltered momentarily in their examination of Caldwell's wound. "All three of them? Alone? You know them too?" Margaret asked, surprised. "I treated one of their victims last year," Hayes said grimly. "Or what was left of him. They don't just kill, they—" He broke off, unwilling to continue. "They make art of it," Isaiah finished for him, his voice oddly subdued. "That's how they see it anyway." Outside, the gunfire had stopped again. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shots had been, heavy with possibilities too, grim to contemplate. 15 minutes now, Isaiah observed, his earlier bravado replaced by something like concern. Even for Nightshade, 3 against 1 is... The batwing doors crashed open, admitting a swirl of snow and a figure that at first glance barely resembled the methodical bartender who had left. Shade stood framed in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut above his left eye and staining the white snow at his feet crimson. His coat was torn at the shoulder, revealing more blood beneath, but his hands were steady as they holstered his weapons. "Margaret," his voice was clipped, professional. "There's a little girl in the doctor's house. She's scared but unharmed. Go to her. Bring her here." She hesitated only briefly before nodding and rushing past him into the night, leaving her rifle propped against the wall. "The McClellans?" Isaiah asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "2 dead," Shade replied, moving to the bar and pouring himself a measure of whiskey. He downed it in a single swallow, then poured another. "The youngest one ran. Gabriel got away?" Fear crept back into Isaiah's voice. "For now." Shade turned to Doc Hayes. "How's William?" "The bullet missed his heart, but—" "Not by much," the doctor replied. "He's lost a lot of blood. He needs surgery, but I can't move him in this condition." Shade nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "You'll have to do it here." Hayes glanced uncertainly at Isaiah and his remaining man. "Under these circumstances?" "Under these circumstances," Shade confirmed, moving to stand between the outlaws and the wounded sheriff. "No one will interfere." Isaiah's laugh was strained. "You still think you're calling the shots? You're bleeding from at least 2 wounds. You've got a lunatic McClellan on the loose, and there's still 2 of us with guns pointed at you." 1.5 at best, Shade replied calmly, nodding toward Liam Sullivan, who was growing paler by the minute from his own wounds. "And as for Gabriel McClellan, he won't be back tonight, not after what happened to his brothers." "What? Oh, did happen?" Doc Hayes asked, even as his hands continued working on Caldwell. A shadow crossed Shade's face. "What needed to happen?" The doors opened again, admitting Margaret and a small, trembling girl no more than 8 years old. Her face was streaked with tears, but physically she appeared unharmed. Margaret led her to a chair, far from the outlaws, wrapping a blanket around her thin shoulders. "Abigail, sweetheart," Margaret soothed. "You're safe now. Can you tell us what happened?" The child's voice came out as little more than a whisper. They killed Papa, broke into our house and... Fresh tears prevented her from continuing. Shade's face hardened into something terrible to behold. "Where's your mother, Abigail?" "Visiting Grandma in Riverstone," the little girl managed. "She's been gone 3 days." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably. "Hell, even I wouldn't," he began, but a look from Shade silenced him instantly. "They were looking for something," Abigail continued, her small voice growing stronger as the initial shock began to wear off. "They kept asking Papa where it was, but he wouldn't tell them." "Where what was?" Margaret asked gently. The little girl shook her head. "I don't know. They got so angry when he wouldn't tell them. Then the scary one, the young one with the strange eyes, he—" She trailed off, more tears flowing. Shade knelt before her, his bloodied appearance somehow not frightening to the child. "Abigail, listen to me. The men who hurt your father, they can't hurt you now, I promise." She looked up at him, trust evident in her tear-filled eyes. "You killed them?" "2 of them," Shade answered honestly. "The 3rd one ran away. Will he come back?" Fear crept into her voice again. Before Shade could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them, many horses, moving fast, despite. "The storm, that'll be Gabriel," Isaiah said, genuine terror in his voice now. "And he's brought friends." Shade moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. His expression revealed nothing, but the subtle tensing of his shoulders told Margaret all she needed to know. "How many?" she asked. "At least 12," Shade replied. "But they're not Gabriel's men." "Then whose?" Isaiah began, but fell silent. As realization dawned, "Oh, hell, it's Harding." Shade turned slowly to face him. "Colonel Richard Harding? The one they call the Executioner." Isaiah nodded, his face ashen. "We had a disagreement, took something of his." "What exactly did you take?" Shade's voice had gone dangerously soft. "Military payroll," Isaiah admitted, "for the entire Northern Territory." "You stole from the U.S. Army?" Margaret couldn't hide her disbelief. "It wasn't supposed to be the Army," Isaiah protested. "Just a standard bank job. How were we supposed to know they'd moved the payroll vault?" Shade closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning patience from some deep reserve. "So the McClellans were after the same payroll." "Probably," Isaiah muttered. "Word travels fast in our circles." The approaching riders had stopped outside, their voices carrying faintly through the howling wind. Commands were being issued, positions assigned with military precision. "They're surrounding the building," Shade observed, moving away from the window. "Standard cavalry encirclement." "What do we do?" Margaret asked, instinctively moving closer. "To the little girl. There's a network of cellars beneath this building," Shade said, his mind clearly racing ahead. "They connect to the old mine tunnels that run under half the town." "You want us to run?" Isaiah scoffed. "That's not the Nightshade I heard about." "I want Margaret, the child, and the doctor to get William somewhere safe," Shade corrected. "You and your men are staying right here." "As hostages?" Liam spat, struggling to sit upright despite his wounds. "As bait," Shade replied coldly. A voice boomed from outside, cutting through the storm with parade ground authority. "This is Colonel Richard Harding of the United States Cavalry. We have the building surrounded. Send out Isaiah Blackwell and—" "His men and the rest of you will be spared." Margaret moved to Shade's side. "They think you're with the Blackwell gang." "Let them think it," Shade replied, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. "For now." "You can't seriously be considering facing off against Harding." Isaiah shook his head in disbelief. "The man has 30 men under his command, all crack shots." "I count 14 outside," Shade corrected, "and they're not shooting anyone tonight." "How can you be so sure?" Shade's smile was cold as the storm outside. "Because Colonel Harding and I are old acquaintances. We served together. Before." This revelation landed in the room like a physical blow. Even Isaiah seemed stunned into silence. "You were a soldier?" Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. "For a time," Shade acknowledged, "until Victoria." Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. She was connected to Harding somehow. She was his daughter. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the moan of the wind and the colonel's voice demanding a response from inside. "So the legendary Nightshade and the Executioner are—" Isaiah couldn't even finish the thought. "Family," Shade supplied, the word carrying a wealth of complicated history. "Or we were." "What happened?" Margaret asked softly. Shade's eyes had taken on that distant quality again, seeing not the saloon before him, but something from long ago. "She died. Harding blamed me. He wasn't entirely wrong." "Nightshade." The colonel's voice had grown more insistent. "I know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Shade moved to the bar, reaching beneath it to retrieve something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a cavalry officer's saber, the blade gleaming. Dully in the lamplight, an ornate H was engraved on the hilt. This was his, Shade explained, seeing Margaret's questioning look. A gift from his father-in-law, Victoria's grandfather. He left it behind at Devil's Gorge. When you faced off against Richard Blackwell, she realized, yes, Harding was there too, though not many people know that part of the story. Shade rewrapped the sword. He was supposed to arrest Blackwell, bring him to justice. Instead, he was going to let him go, for a price. My father bribed a U.S. Army colonel. Isaiah appeared genuinely shocked. Your father bribed everyone, Shade replied. It's how he stayed free as long as he did, but that day at Devil's Gorge, I arrived before the exchange could happen. Understanding dawned on Isaiah's face. You weren't just after my father. You were after Harding, too. I was. After justice, Shade corrected. Victoria had died the month before, killed by Richard Blackwell's men while trying to expose her father's corruption. The official story was that outlaws attacked their carriage. Only 3 people knew the truth. Me, Harding, and William Caldwell, who was a lieutenant under Harding's command at the time. So that's why he's been after you all these years, Margaret said quietly. Not just for killing Blackwell, but for knowing his secret. For that. And for this. Shade tapped the wrapped saber. It's the only physical evidence tying him to the conspiracy. His family crest is engraved alongside Blackwell's mark inside the hilt, proof of their arrangement. Another voice called from outside, this one younger but carrying the same authoritative tone. This is Captain James Harding. You have 1 minute to surrender, or we burn you out. His son, Shade murmured. He was just a boy when Victoria died. He wouldn't remember me. You can't win this fight, Isaiah said, something like genuine concern in his voice. Even you can't take on 14 trained soldiers, plus Harding and his son. I don't intend to fight them, Shade replied, moving to help Doc Hayes prepare Caldwell for transport. Margaret, show the doctor and Abigail the passage to the tunnels. Take the East Fork. It leads to the old church. You should be safe there. What about you? She asked, even as she moved to gather. Supplies. I'm going to have a long overdue conversation with my father-in-law, Shade said, checking his weapons one last time. And then I'm going to arrest Isaiah Blackwell. Arrest? Isaiah laughed despite himself. Since when does Nightshade arrest? Anyone. Shade's eyes met his, calm and certain. Since William Caldwell showed me a better way. As Margaret and Hayes worked to move Caldwell toward the hidden cellar entrance, Shade turned to the little girl, who had watched the entire exchange, with solemn eyes too old for her young face. Abigail, he said gently, I'm going to make sure the man who hurt your father pays for what he did. I promise you that. The child studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting his word with the simple faith of the young. 30 seconds! Captain Harding called from outside. This is your final warning! Shade strode to the batwing doors, the wrapped saber in one hand. With the other, he drew a single Remington, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. What are you doing? Margaret asked, pausing in her work. Keeping a promise, Shade replied. Several, actually. Before anyone could stop him, he pushed through the doors and stepped out into the swirling snow, his tall figure silhouetted briefly against the white before the storm enveloped him. Colonel Harding, his voice carried clearly despite the wind. I believe this belongs to you. From inside the saloon, they heard the colonel's startled response. Mitchell? Thomas Mitchell? Is that really you? Not anymore. Shade's reply was faint but distinct. They call me Nightshade now. Isaiah moved to the window, peering out into the storm. Well, I'll be damned, he whispered. The son of a bitch is just standing there in the middle of the street, facing down 14 armed men, and they're lowering their weapons. Margaret joined him at the window, her rifle forgotten in her hands, as she watched the scene unfolding in the snowy street. Shade stood alone, facing a line of mounted soldiers, their horses nervous in the whipping wind. At their center sat two men, one older, his beard streaked with grey, the other younger but with the same commanding presence. "What's happening?" she asked, unable to make out the words being exchanged. "Don't know," Isaiah admitted. "But whatever it is, your bartender just changed the rules of the game." In the street, Shade had unwrapped the saber, holding it up so that the blade caught what little moonlight penetrated the storm. Even from a distance, they could see Colonel Harding stiffen. "In his saddle, that's it," Isaiah whispered. "The evidence, he's showing it to them all." The tableau held for what seemed an eternity, Shade standing firm against the storm, the cavalry arrayed before him like an execution squad, the gleaming saber raised between them like both accusation and offering. Then, with deliberate ceremony, Shade reversed his grip on the weapon, holding it out handle first toward the colonel. A peace offering, a choice. "What is he doing?" Margaret breathed. "That's his only leverage." The colonel dismounted slowly, his movements stiff with more than just the cold. He approached Shade with the caution of a man confronting a ghost, stopping a few paces away. Words were exchanged that didn't carry to the watchers at the window, heated at first, then gradually calming. Then, in a gesture that left both Margaret and Isaiah speechless, Colonel Harding removed his sidearm and handed it to his son. He took the saber from Shade, examined it for a long moment, then snapped the blade over his knee. "He's destroying the evidence," Isaiah realized. Why would his question was answered as Harding drew himself to attention and offered Shade a formal military salute. "Surrender," Margaret understood suddenly. "He's surrendering to the law." "To a bartender?" Isaiah couldn't hide his disbelief. "No," Margaret corrected quietly. "To Nightshade." As they watched, Shade returned the salute, then gestured toward the saloon. The colonel nodded, issuing commands to his men, who immediately began to dismount and form a perimeter. "I think our time has run out," Isaiah said grimly, raising his gun once more. "If I'm going down, I'm taking that traitor Harding with me." Margaret swung her rifle around to face him. "Don't be a fool. It's over." "It's not over until I say it's over," Isaiah snarled, moving toward the door. "My father may have been many things, but he was never a coward. I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering without a fight." The batwing doors swung open, admitting Shade, the colonel, and Captain Harding. Snow dusted their shoulders, melting in the warmth of the saloon to form small puddles on the wooden floor. "Isaiah Blackwell," Shade said formally, "you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and assaulting an officer of the law." Isaiah's gun swung toward the colonel. "You first, you double-crossing bass." He never finished the sentence. Shade's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor, his unfired weapon skittering across the boards. 3 years, Shade said quietly, holstering his smoking Remington. 3 years of peace, learning to be a better man, and all it took was one night to remind me of what I used to be. "Not all of it," Colonel Harding said, his voice gruff with emotion. "The Thomas Mitchell I knew would have killed him, and probably me too." "The night's not over yet," Shade replied, but there was no real threat in his words. Captain Harding stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "What about the McClellan brother? The survivor?" A cold smile played across Shade's lips. "Gabriel McClellan won't be bothering anyone again, ever." The colonel raised an eyebrow. "You said he escaped." "I said he ran," Shade corrected. "I didn't say he got far." Understanding passed between the men, a grim acknowledgement of frontier justice that required no further explanation. "And me?" the colonel asked quietly. "What happens to me now?" Shade's eyes met his, years of complicated history passing between them. That depends on William Caldwell. If he lives, you'll stand trial for corruption and conspiracy. If he dies... He let the implication hang in the air. You'd hunt me down, Harding stated. Not a question, but a resigned acceptance. To the ends of the earth, Shade confirmed. For Victoria, the name fell between them like the final card in a losing hand. Harding's shoulders slumped, the fight going out of him all at once. She would have hated what I became, he admitted. What we both became. For the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed Shade's face. Not anger or hatred, but a profound weariness. Yes, she would have. As the cavalry soldiers began securing the wounded Blackwell gang members, Margaret approached Shade. Is it really over? Or, she asked quietly. He looked around the bullet-scarred saloon, at the bloodstains that would never quite wash out, at the men who had brought violence to her door. Almost, he replied. There's still Gabriel McClellan to deal with. You said he wouldn't be bothering anyone again. I lied, Shade admitted. The third brother escaped into the storm. And as long as he's out there, this isn't over. Outside the wind howled with renewed fury, as if to emphasize his words. The storm had intensified, turning Timber Creek into a ghost town of swirling white and impenetrable shadow. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a wounded Gabriel McClellan was plotting his revenge, nursing his hatred like the only flame that could keep him alive. Then what do we do? Margaret asked. Shade checked his weapons one final time, his expression settling into grim resolve. We end it, once and for all. Dawn broke reluctantly over Timber Creek, the pale winter sun struggling to penetrate the aftermath of the storm. Fresh snow blanketed the town in pristine white, concealing the evidence of the previous night's violence beneath a deceptive veil of purity. Only the dark patches of frozen blood near the doctor's house and the trampled snow around. The wayward raven betrayed the truth of what had transpired. Inside the saloon, transformation was underway. The cavalry soldiers had converted the space into a makeshift headquarters, clearing debris and arranging tables to accommodate maps and equipment. Colonel Harding stood at the center, directing operations with the efficiency of a man accustomed to command, though the haunted look in his eyes suggested his mind occasionally wandered to darker considerations. Captain James Harding approached his father, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Scouts report no sign of McClellan within 5 miles of town. Trail went cold at Blackwater Ridge, where the storm hit hardest. He's still out there, the colonel replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. A man like Gabriel McClellan doesn't just disappear, unless Nightshade was telling the truth about finishing him, the captain suggested. Colonel Harding's gaze drifted to the corner where Shade sat alone, methodically cleaning his Remingtons with the same care he once devoted to polishing glasses. The former bartender had barely spoken since returning from a pre-dawn scouting expedition, his face betraying nothing of what he might have found. No, the colonel said quietly, he wasn't telling the truth. He wanted to draw McClellan's attention solely to himself. In the back room that had been converted to a medical ward, Doc Hayes worked tirelessly over Sheriff Caldwell. The lawman's condition had stabilized during the night, though he remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Margaret sat beside him, her vigilance unbroken despite the exhaustion evident in her face. The doctor straightened, rubbing his lower back. He's strong, stubborn too. Good qualities when you're fighting to stay alive. Will he make it? Margaret asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice throughout the long night. If infection doesn't set in, yes. The next 24 hours will tell. Hayes moved to check on Isaiah Blackwell, who lay handcuffed to a cot across the room, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his eyes alert and watchful. And what about me, Doc? Isaiah asked, forced joviality masking genuine concern. Am I going to live long enough to hang? Not my department. Hayes replied tersely, checking the outlaw's bandages with professional detachment. Though if I were you, I'd be more worried about what happens when Gabriel McClellan comes looking for the payroll you stole. Isaiah's facade of bravado slipped momentarily. The army has its money back. Why would he still be after me? Because men like McClellan don't just want things. Shade's voice came from the doorway where he now stood watching the exchange. They want to take things. The payroll is just a symbol now, a prize he was denied. He moved into the room, nodding briefly to Margaret before focusing on Caldwell. Any change? He opened his eyes briefly about an hour ago, she reported. Didn't say anything, but he seemed to recognize me. Something like relief flickered across Shade's face before his expression returned to its customary impassivity. Good. He's fighting. Unlike you, Isaiah taunted from his cot, the great Nightshade, hiding behind the U.S. cavalry instead of finishing what he started. Shade regarded him with the dispassionate interest one might show an insect under glass. I'm not hiding, Isaiah. I'm waiting. For what? McClellan to come to you? Isaiah scoffed. He's halfway to Mexico by now. No. Shade shook his head slightly. He's still out there, watching, planning. Gabriel McClellan doesn't run. Not when there's blood to be spilled. His certainty sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the walls. Margaret rose, moving to Shade's side. You've seen something, she said quietly, on your scouting trip this morning. Shade didn't answer immediately, his eyes moving to the window where weak sunlight illuminated dancing dust motes. Two of Colonel Harding's men disappeared from the northern perimeter at first light. No shots fired, no signs of struggle, just gone. McClellan's work, Hayes asked, his medical instruments forgotten in his hands. His signature, Shade confirmed. Gabriel likes to hunt. The best prey, he once told me, are those who think they're the hunters. You've encountered him before, Margaret realized. A ghost of old pain crossed Shade's face. Once. Few people meet Gabriel McClellan twice. When was this? Isaiah asked, his typical bravado replaced by genuine curiosity. After Devil's Gorge, Shade replied. Before Victoria died. He was working with your father then too. Isaiah's face registered shock. My father would never associate with... Your father, Shade cut him off, worked with anyone who served his purpose, even monsters like Gabriel. Before Isaiah could respond, a commotion erupted from the main room of the saloon. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. Colonel Harding appeared in the doorway, his face grim. We found Private Reynolds and Corporal Davis. Dead? Shade asked, though it wasn't really a question. What was left of them? The colonel confirmed. Strung up in the old oak tree at the edge of town. There was a message, carved into Reynolds' chest, for me, Shade stated. The colonel nodded. It said, Nightshade, dusk alone. A heavy silence descended upon the room, broken finally by Margaret's whispered, You can't go. I don't have a choice. Shade replied, his voice calm, almost detached. If I don't meet him, he'll keep killing, you one by one, until I do. Then let him come here, Colonel Harding argued. We have 14 trained men, fortified positions. He'd be walking into a slaughter. Shade's smile held no humor. Gabriel doesn't walk into slaughters. He creates them the moment I refuse his challenge. This entire town becomes a hunting ground. And if you go alone, Margaret demanded, what then? Then it ends, Shade said simply. One way or another. The colonel studied him with the calculating eye of a military strategist. You have a plan. I always have a plan. Outside, the winter sun had begun its early descent toward the western mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Time, like hope, was running short in Timber Creek. We have 6 hours until dusk, Shade continued, checking his weapons with practiced precision. I need two things: a map of every building, cellar and alley in this town, and someone who can draw. The request was unexpected enough to momentarily confuse the others. Draw, Hayes repeated. As in, pictures? Precisely, Shade confirmed. Gabriel McClellan may be a monster, but he's a creature of habit. He always scouts his killing grounds thoroughly before engaging. I intend to use that against him. Understanding dawned on the colonel's face. You're going to give him misinformation, guide him into a trap. No, Shade corrected. I'm going to give him exactly what he expects. Nightshade alone at dusk, but on my terms, not his. Margaret watched him with growing concern. You really believe you can outthink a madman? I don't need to outthink him, Shade replied. I just need him to think he's outthinking me. For the next hour, Shade worked methodically with Captain Harding, who proved to have considerable artistic skill, creating detailed sketches of the town from multiple angles, but with subtle, critical alterations. Buildings slightly repositioned, alleyways that didn't exist, escape routes that led nowhere. McClellan will have watched the town, Shade explained as they worked. But he won't have memorized every detail. He'll use these reference points to plan his approach, and when he does, the captain began. He'll be exactly where I want him to be, Shade finished. Isaiah, who had been permitted to join the planning session under heavy guard, studied the altered maps with reluctant admiration. Clever. But there's something you're not considering. And what's that? Colonel Harding asked coldly. McClellan isn't coming for Nightshade because of some petty grudge, Isaiah pointed out. He's coming because Nightshade killed his brothers. This is about family. The word hung in the air like gunsmoke, heavy with implications. Shade's hands stilled momentarily on the map. He's right, Margaret said quietly. Gabriel won't just want to kill you. He'll want to hurt you first, through someone you care about. Shade's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary calculation, a shifting of possibilities. Then we use that too, he decided. If Gabriel wants to hurt me through others, he'll need to identify who matters to me. He'll have been watching long enough to know, Colonel Harding pointed out. Margaret, Hayes, Caldwell, they're the obvious targets. Yes, Shade nodded slowly, which is why they won't be where Gabriel expects them to be. Outside, the afternoon sun gleamed on the pristine snow, creating a dazzling landscape of white and shadow. To casual observers, Timber Creek appeared peaceful, almost idyllic in its winter slumber. Only those who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs of preparation. The strategically positioned mirrors in upper windows, the freshly oiled door hinges, the barely visible wires strung between buildings at precise heights. The preparations continued. Little Abigail Peters sat quietly in a corner of the saloon, watching the adults with solemn eyes. When Shade approached her, she didn't flinch despite his fearsome reputation and blood-stained clothing. "Your papa was a brave man," he said, kneeling to her level. "I didn't know him well, but I saw how he kept this town safe during the floods. Last spring," the child nodded, accepting this tribute to her father with quiet dignity. "Are you going to kill the bad man who hurt Papa?" The question, asked with such direct simplicity, momentarily took Shade aback. He considered his answer. "Carefully, I'm going to stop him," he replied finally, "so he can never hurt anyone else." Abigail studied him with eyes too old for her young face. "Sheriff Caldwell says killing is always wrong, but is it wrong to kill someone who kills others?" The philosophical depth of the question from such a young child was startling. Shade glanced up to find Margaret watching them, her expression unreadable. "Your sheriff is a wiser man than I am," Shade told the girl honestly. "He believes every life has value, even the worst ones. That's why he's a lawman, and I'm just a bartender." "But you weren't always a bartender," Abigail observed with a child's unerring perception. "You were something else before." "Yes," Shade admitted. "I was." And now, the question hung between them. Deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. What was he now? Nightshade the killer? Shade the bartender? Thomas Mitchell the soldier? Or something else entirely? Something still forming in the crucible of this violent night? Before he could answer, Colonel Harding approached, his expression grim. 2 hours till dusk. It's time. Shade rose, his decision made. Whatever he had been, whatever he might yet become, for now he had a purpose, a role to fulfill. The town of Timber Creek, and everyone in it, depended on him making the right choice. Get everyone into position, he instructed, and make sure those mirrors are angled exactly as I specified. As the final preparations were made, Shade checked his Remingtons one last time, then donned his coat and hat. The familiar weight of his guns provided no comfort, only a grim reminder of what lay ahead. You don't have to do this alone, Margaret said, approaching him as he prepared to step out into the gathering dusk. Yes, he replied quietly, I do. Without another word, Nightshade stepped through the bat-wing doors and into the cold embrace of destiny, leaving behind the warmth of the saloon and perhaps the man he had become during those 3 peaceful years. The hunting ground awaited, and with it a reckoning long overdue. Dusk settled over Timber Creek like a funeral shroud, painting the snow-covered street in hues of violet and indigo. The temperature dropped sharply as the last light faded, transforming exhaled breath into ghostly apparitions that lingered momentarily before dissolving into the gathering darkness. The town had taken on an abandoned quality. Shutters closed, lamps extinguished, an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional creak of wooden structures contracting in the cold. Shade stood motionless in the center of the street, his dark silhouette a solitary challenge against the deepening twilight. Steam rose from the shoulders of his coat where snowflakes landed and melted, creating a spectral aura around him. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning rooftops, windows, alleyways. Any vantage point a predator might exploit. From her hidden position in the hayloft of the livery stable, Margaret watched through a narrow gap in the weathered boards. Colonel Harding had stationed her there with a rifle and strict instructions not to reveal herself unless the situation became dire. The military man now crouched behind a water trough 2 buildings away, his experienced eyes evaluating the same tactical possibilities that Shade was considering. Other figures waited in strategic locations throughout the town. Captain Harding and 3 of his most trusted men positioned in the church steeple. Doc Hayes, sequestered in the cellar beneath the general store, with little Abigail and the still unconscious Sheriff Caldwell, and the remaining cavalry soldiers hidden within structures that provided clear fields of fire while offering substantial protection. Isaiah Blackwell had been secured in the jail's reinforced cell, his protests falling on deaf ears when he demanded to be part of the ambush. "McClellan's as much my problem as yours," he'd argued, but Shade had merely fixed him with a cold stare until the outlaw fell silent. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour as Shade maintained his exposed position. No sign of Gabriel McClellan materialized. The only movement came from occasional eddies of wind-driven snow, swirling around street corners like restless spirits. Then something changed. A subtle shift in the quality of silence, like the moment when prey senses a predator's presence before actually seeing it. Shade felt it rather than heard it, an almost imperceptible disruption in the night's stillness. "I know you're here, Gabriel," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the frigid air. No need for theatrics. Laughter answered him, a soft, almost childlike sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "But I like theatrics, Nightshade," a high, sing-song voice replied. "They add texture to the performance." Margaret suppressed a shudder There was something profoundly wrong about that voice. Its cadence, its tone, its very essence conveyed a mind fundamentally broken. "Your brothers went for direct confrontation," Shade responded, turning slowly to scan the darkened buildings. "Didn't work out well for them. My brothers lacked imagination." Gabriel's disembodied voice floated from a different direction now. "They never understood the artistry of what we do." "And what is it that we do, Gabriel?" A pause, then. "We reveal truth through suffering. We liberate souls from their cages of flesh. We kill people." Shade interrupted flatly. "Let's not dress it up." Another laugh, closer this time. "Always so literal. That's why you'll never be anything more than what you are. A killer with a conscience. A wolf who thinks he's a sheepdog." Shade's expression remained impassive, but his hand drifted slightly closer to his holster. "At least I know what I am." "What are you, Gabriel? Man, animal, monster?" "I am evolution," Gabriel replied, and suddenly there he was, stepping out from behind the undertaker's shop, a slender figure dressed entirely in black, save for a shock of white blonde hair that caught what little light remained. Despite his reputation for savagery, Gabriel McClellan appeared almost delicate, fine-boned and graceful in his movements, more dancing master than killer. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, pale, almost colorless, and utterly devoid of humanity. They moved constantly, taking in details with the calculating assessment of a predator selecting the most vulnerable point to strike. "You positioned the sheriff's woman in the livery," Gabriel observed casually, gesturing toward Margaret's hiding place without looking directly at it. "The colonel behind the water trough. The captain and 3 men in the church tower. How predictable." Margaret felt ice form in her veins. He'd known their positions all along. "If you knew it was a trap, why come?" Shade asked, seemingly unperturbed. By this revelation, Gabriel smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "The same reason you called me out, knowing I'd bring this." From within his coat, he produced a detonator connected to a wire that disappeared beneath the snow. "Enough dynamite to reduce half this town to splinters, placed during the night while your cavalry friends were occupied with my little distractions." Colonel Harding rose slightly from his position, his face a mask of controlled fury. 2 of his men were dead because of this madman's distractions. "So here we are," Gabriel continued, twirling the detonator cord around one finger with casual menace. "You surrounded by allies who dare not shoot for fear of triggering an explosion. Me, with the power to unmake everything you've tried to protect. Quite the stalemate." Shade studied him with the detached interest of a chess player evaluating an unexpected move. "Not quite. You've overlooked something." "Have I?" Gabriel's voice remained light, almost playful. "Do tell." "You've spent so long watching us, you forgot to check if someone was watching you." Shade's gaze shifted slightly, looking past Gabriel's shoulder. "Isn't that right, William?" Gabriel spun around, but the street behind him remained empty. In that split second of distraction, Shade moved with blinding speed, covering half the distance between them before Gabriel realized the deception and turned back. "Clever," the killer acknowledged, his finger tightening on the detonator, "but futile. One more step, and I send us all to meet your precious Victoria." Shade froze. "You didn't know Victoria." "Oh, but I did." Gabriel's smile widened grotesquely. "Your lovely wife, Colonel Harding's cherished daughter. I was there, you know, when she died." From his position, Colonel Harding made a strangled sound, half rage, half anguish. "You're lying," Shade said, but doubt had crept into his voice. Gabriel's pale eyes gleamed with malicious delight. "She called for you at the end, begged for mercy. I gave her release instead." A tremor passed through Shade's frame. Not fear, but rage so pure it momentarily shattered his careful composure. His hand twitched toward his gun. "That's it," Gabriel encouraged, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. Become what you truly are, Nightshade the merciless, the legend who leaves no survivors. In the livery loft, Margaret raised her rifle, sighting along the barrel at Gabriel's head. One shot might end this madness, but if his finger spasmed on the detonator in death— "I know what you're doing," Shade said, visibly regaining control. "Trying to provoke me, make me careless." Gabriel shrugged, unperturbed. "Worth a try. Your restraint is so disappointing. The stories paint you as much more exciting. Stories exaggerate." "Do they?" Gabriel's head tilted slightly, bird-like in its curiosity. "They say you killed 30 men when Victoria died, that you hunted them across 3 territories, executing them one by one. Was that an exaggeration?" Shade didn't answer, but something cold and terrible moved behind his eyes, a glimpse of the man he had once been, the killer who had earned his reputation through blood and merciless efficiency. "I thought not," Gabriel smiled, satisfied by whatever he'd seen in Shade's expression. "We're not so different, you and I. We both understand that death is the only truth in this miserable world." "We're nothing alike," Shade countered. "You kill for pleasure, I killed for justice." "Justice." Gabriel laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Such a quaint concept. Did those 30 men all deserve to die, every single one? Or did you simply need to feed the darkness inside you, the same darkness that lives in me?" For a moment Shade seemed to have no answer. Then, unexpectedly, he relaxed his posture and moved his hands away from his weapons. "There was a time when I might have agreed with you," he admitted. "When Victoria died, I became something inhuman. I'd convinced myself it was righteous vengeance, but you're right, part of me enjoyed it. The power, the fear I inspired." Gabriel's expression registered genuine surprise at this confession. "But then I met a man," Shade continued, "William Caldwell. He saw what I was becoming and offered me something I didn't know I needed, a way back. Redemption." "Redemption," Gabriel scoffed. "Another illusion. Men like us don't change our nature." "Not our nature, perhaps, but our choices." Shade took another half-step forward. "That's what separates us, Gabriel. Not what we've done, but what we choose to do next." Gabriel's finger tightened on the detonator. "And what will you choose, Nightshade? To die protecting these sheep, to sacrifice yourself for your precious redemption?" "Look around you," Shade said quietly. "What do you see?" Gabriel's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he made a show of glancing around the empty street. "A pathetic town not worth saving. A collection of buildings that will burn just as easily as any other." "Look again," Shade instructed. "At the snow." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Gabriel's face. He glanced down at the pristine snow surrounding them, unmarked save for his own footprints and Shade's. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" he demanded. "Where are the wires?" Shade asked simply. Gabriel's gaze darted to the detonator in his hand, then to the snow where the connecting wire disappeared beneath the surface. He followed its path with his eyes, suddenly noticing what should have been obvious. No other. Wires led away from their position, no trails in the snow where additional explosives might have been placed. "Impossible," he whispered. "I set charges at every major building. The church, the general store, the saloon." "No," Shade shook his head. "You planned to, but something happened before you could execute your plan, something you didn't anticipate." Gabriel's face contorted with growing panic as realization dawned. "The storm, it came earlier than predicted, forced me to seek shelter, leaving you time to place only one charge," Shade finished for him, "the one at your feet." Gabriel looked down in horror at the snow beneath him, suddenly understanding. The trap he'd walked into. "That's why you chose this spot for our confrontation," he snarled. "You knew." "I suspected," Shade corrected. "When we found the bodies of Harding's men, they had residue on their gloves, dynamite residue, but there wasn't enough missing from the mining company's stores for more than 1 or 2 charges." Gabriel's manic confidence cracked further, revealing the chaos beneath. "It doesn't matter. I'll still take you with me." "Maybe," Shade acknowledged, "but no one else. Your grand performance, your masterpiece of destruction, reduced to a murder-suicide in an empty street. No audience, no legend, just nothing. It was the perfect psychological assault, targeting not Gabriel's fear of death, but his narcissistic need for spectacle and infamy." The killer's face twisted through a kaleidoscope of emotions: rage, disbelief, thwarted ambition, before settling into a mask of pure hatred. "Then I'll just have to improvise a new ending," he hissed, abandoning the detonator and drawing two long, wickedly curved knives from his coat with blinding speed. He lunged at Shade, blades slashing in complex patterns designed to overwhelm any defense. But Shade didn't draw his guns. Instead, he stepped into the attack, catching Gabriel's wrists and redirecting his momentum in a fluid movement that sent them both crashing into a snowdrift. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and flashing metal, snow spraying in all directions as they fought for dominance. Despite his slender build, Gabriel possessed unnatural strength, fueled by madness and hate. One of his blades found its mark, slicing across Shade's ribs and drawing a hiss of pain. In the livery loft, Margaret tracked the struggling figures through her rifle sight, unable to find a clear shot as they grappled. Colonel Harding had emerged from his hiding place, his own weapon trained on the combatants, but similarly unable to intervene without risking Shade's life. Gabriel gained momentary advantage, straddling Shade and raising both knives for a killing blow. "Die knowing you failed," he snarled. "Die with—" His words cut off abruptly as Shade surged upward, driving something into the killer's chest with enough force to lift him off the ground. Gabriel looked down in bewilderment at the handle of his own knife protruding from between. "His ribs, when did you—" he gasped, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "When you were monologuing," Shade replied, pushing the mortally wounded man off him and rising to his feet. "A habit that's killed more men than bad aim." Gabriel collapsed onto his back in the snow, his life bleeding out in a spreading crimson stain that steamed in the frigid air. His pale eyes fixed on Shade with a mixture of hatred and something almost like admiration. "Was any of it true?" Shade asked quietly. "About Victoria?" Gabriel's lips stretched in a ghastly smile. "You'll never know," he whispered. "That's my final gift to you. Nightshade. Uncertainty." With those words, the light faded from his eyes, leaving them as empty in death as they had been in life. Shade stood over the corpse for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, deliberately, he bent down and closed Gabriel's eyes, a small gesture of humanity for a man who had possessed none. "It's over," Colonel Harding said, approaching cautiously. "All of it." "No," Shade replied, turning toward the wayward Raven, where lights had begun to appear in the windows as word of McClellan's death spread. "It's just beginning." As townsfolk emerged tentatively from their homes and hiding places, Shade walked slowly back toward the saloon, leaving the dead man and his bloody past behind in the rapidly freezing snow. Whatever came next, judgment, forgiveness, or something in between, would be determined not by who he had been, but by the choices he would make in the dawning hours of this new day. The legend of Nightshade might never die, but perhaps Thomas. Shade. Morgan could finally start to live. 3 days after Gabriel McClellan's death, Timber Creek began to resemble itself again. The bloodstains had been scrubbed away, the bullet holes plastered over, and the shattered glass replaced. Yet something fundamental had changed, a collective awareness that had awakened in the town's residents. They moved differently now, more alert, more appreciative of the fragile nature of peace. At the wayward Raven, Shade stood behind the bar, methodically polishing glasses just as he had done for 3 years. To casual observers, he appeared unchanged by recent events. The same quiet bartender who measured whiskey and minded his own business. But those who knew him well could see subtle differences, a new openness in his posture, a lessening of the vigilant tension that had been his constant companion. The bat-wing doors swung open, admitting Sheriff Caldwell. The lawman moved gingerly, one hand resting lightly on his bandaged chest, but his eyes were clear and his back straight with hard-won dignity. "Should you be out of bed?" Shade asked, already pouring coffee into Caldwell's usual mug. Doc Hayes said light activity would do me good, Caldwell replied, easing himself onto a stool. "Besides, there's unfinished business that needs attending." Shade nodded, understanding the unspoken. Colonel Harding and his cavalry unit had departed that morning, escorting Isaiah Blackwell and his surviving men to territorial authorities. The colonel's own fate remained uncertain. His confession to past corruption had been made in private to Caldwell, with the understanding that justice would be tempered with consideration for his recent actions in defense of the town. "You could have gone with them," Caldwell observed. "Fresh start somewhere else. No one would blame you." Shade's hands stilled momentarily on the glass he was polishing. "Thought about it? What changed your mind?" Instead of answering directly, Shade glanced around the saloon. Margaret was at her usual place by the ledger, little Abigail beside her learning simple arithmetic. Doc Hayes occupied his regular table. Engrossed in a medical journal, old Jenkins nursed his morning rye in the corner, while Claire Summers arranged sheet music at the piano. "3 years ago you offered me a choice," Shade said finally. "Said I could keep running from what I'd done, or I could stop and build something worth having." Caldwell nodded slowly. "I remember." "Took me a while to understand what you meant," Shade continued. "I thought you were talking about redemption, balancing the scales somehow, but that's not it, is it?" "No," Caldwell agreed. "It's not about erasing the past. It's about choosing a future worth living for." The two men fell silent, sharing the comfortable understanding that comes from surviving darkness together. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, gentle flakes that drifted lazily past the windows rather than the driving blizzard of days before. "Colonel Harding left something for you," Caldwell said after a time, removing an envelope from his coat pocket. "Asked me to give it to you once things had settled." Shade accepted the envelope with mild curiosity. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing official-looking text, along with a smaller, sealed letter. His expression remained impassive as he read the document, but something shifted in his eyes. "A pardon," he said quietly. "Full and unconditional, for all actions committed as Nightshade." Harding called in every favor he had left, Caldwell explained. "Said it was the least he could do for Victoria's sake." Shade tucked the pardon away and broke the seal on the personal letter. His face softened as he read the colonel's flowing script, words meant for him alone, a reconciliation of sorts between two men connected by love and loss. "Will you see him again?" Caldwell asked when Shade had finished reading. "Perhaps," Shade replied, folding the letter carefully. "Some wounds heal cleaner with distance." The doors opened again, admitting a gust of snow-laden wind and a stranger, a young man. In trail-worn clothes, his face pinched with cold and hunger. He approached the bar hesitantly, eyeing Shade with the caution of someone who had learned to expect hostility. "Help you?" Shade asked, already reaching for a clean glass. Hoping for work, the young man replied, "Been riding from Clearwater Junction. Heard there might be opportunities here." "What's your name, son?" Caldwell inquired, studying the newcomer with professional interest. "Michael Reeves, sir." The young man straightened under the sheriff's scrutiny. "I can handle horses. Mintac swing a hammer if needed." Shade and Caldwell exchanged glances, a silent communication born of long association. "Saloon could use another pair of hands," Shade said finally. "Winter nights get busy." Relief washed over the young man's face. "I'm obliged, mister." "Shade," he supplied, extending his hand. "Just Shade," As the young man grasped his hand, Shade noted the calluses of honest work rather than the telltale marks of a gunman. Another soul seeking refuge, perhaps, or simply a fresh beginning. Margaret approached, little Abigail beside her. The child had begun to smile again in recent days, the resilience of youth gradually overcoming trauma. "We're heading to visit the cemetery," Margaret explained. "Abigail wants to leave flowers for her father." She hesitated, then added, "She asked if you would come along, Shade." Something moved behind Shade's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or quiet gratitude for this small inclusion in the rituals of normal life. "I'll watch the bar," Caldwell offered before Shade could respond. "Go on." Shade hung up his apron and reached for his coat, a new one without bloodstains or bullet holes. He paused with his hand on the shotgun beneath the counter, a fleeting habit from a different life, then deliberately moved away without touching it. "Ready when you are," he told Abigail, who slipped her small hand trustingly into his as they stepped outside into the gentle snowfall. Margaret beside them, Shade cast one final glance back at the saloon. Sheriff Caldwell raised his coffee mug in silent salute, acknowledgement of a journey completed and another just beginning. The legend of Nightshade would persist in frontier tales, growing more elaborate with each retelling. But here in Timber Creek, a different story was taking shape, one of a quiet bartender who polished glasses with careful hands, who listened more than he spoke, and who had found, at long last, something worth protecting without violence. Thomas. Shade. Morgan walked into the falling snow, not as a ghost or a legend, but simply as a man who had finally come home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.